They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But what happens when that dish turns into a 5-course meal that destroys everything in its path? My name is Jessica Chen, and 3 years ago, I was just another face in the crowd at Morrison & Associates Financial Group in downtown Seattle. Today, I'm sitting in the corner office on the 47th floor, watching my former boss clean out his desk through security cameras. But this story isn't about climbing the corporate ladder. It's about burning it down and rebuilding it in my own image. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. It all started with 5 words that changed everything. "You're just a secretary, Jessica." The rain was hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Morrison & Associates when I first heard those words. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and I'd been working as an executive assistant for 3 years. Not a secretary. An executive assistant. There's a difference, though apparently not to my boss, Derek Morrison. Derek was the kind of man who wore his privilege like an expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. At 38, he'd inherited the family business from his father, Richard Morrison, who'd built the investment firm from nothing in the 1980s. Derek had never known struggle, never known what it meant to work for every opportunity. His corner office overlooked Elliott Bay, and he spent most of his time in meetings that could have been emails, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees' lives. I, on the other hand, had earned every single thing I had. Born in a small town outside Spokane, I'd worked 3 jobs to put myself through Washington State University, graduating summa cum laude with degrees in both business administration and finance. My parents, who'd immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but hope and determination, had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had. After college, I'd moved to Seattle with 2 suitcases and a dream of breaking into the financial world. Morrison & Associates had been my entry point. The executive assistant position wasn't glamorous, but it paid well and gave me a front-row seat to how major financial decisions were made. I organized Derek's calendar, managed his correspondence, prepared his presentations, and often found myself quietly fixing his mistakes before they reached his father or the board of directors. The morning everything changed like any other. I arrived at the office at 7:30, a full hour before Derek stumbled in with his usual hangover and Starbucks addiction. I'd already reviewed the day's market reports, prepared briefings for his meetings, and organized the quarterly performance data he'd need for the afternoon board presentation. Derek's assistant before me had lasted 6 months. The one before that, I'd been there 3 years, which made me something of a record holder. I'd learned to anticipate his needs, smooth over his social mistakes, and most importantly, stay invisible. In Derek's world, good help was meant to be neither seen nor heard. But that Tuesday was different. The board meeting was crucial. Morrison & Associates was considering a major acquisition that would either catapult the company to new heights or potentially destroy it. Derek's presentation needed to be flawless, and I'd spent the previous weekend making sure it was. At 9:15, Derek burst through the glass doors of the executive floor, his hair disheveled and his tie askew. He'd clearly been out late again, probably at one of his usual haunts in Capitol Hill. Without so much as a greeting, he barked at me from across the reception area. "Jessica, where's the Henderson file? I need it now." I looked up from my computer, where I'd been tracking the morning's market fluctuations. "It's on your desk, Mr. Morrison, right where I placed it yesterday afternoon, along with the updated projections and the risk assessment report." He disappeared into his office, and I could hear him shuffling papers aggressively. 30 seconds later, he emerged, his face flushed with irritation. "This isn't what I asked for. I specifically said I needed the Q3 comparisons, not this garbage." I maintained my composure, though my jaw tightened slightly. "The Q3 comparisons are in the blue folder, tab 3. The garbage you're referring to is the analysis that shows why the Henderson acquisition would be a mistake." Derek's eyes flashed dangerous. He didn't like being corrected, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. "Excuse me?" I stood up slowly, smoothing my black pencil skirt. At 28, I'd learned that confidence was often the only weapon available to people like me. The numbers don't lie, Mr. Morris. Henderson Industries is hemorrhaging money. Their debt-to-equity ratio is unsustainable, and their market share has been declining for 18 months. Acquiring them would be like buying a sinking ship. I didn't ask for your opinion, Derek snapped, his voice carrying across the open floor plan where other employees were pretending not to listen. I asked for the files, and I gave you the files, along with the analysis you'll need to make an informed decision. Derek stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that made my skin crawl. He was tall, probably 6'2", and he used his height to intimidate. His breath smelled like coffee and something else. Vodka. Maybe. Let me make something very clear to you, Jessica, he said, his voice low and menacing. You're just a secretary. Your job is to file papers, answer phones, and bring me coffee. It's not to think, it's not to analyze, it's not to have opinions about multi-million-dollar business decisions. Do you understand me? The words hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, 3 years of swallowed pride, ignored contributions, and professional invisibility crystallized into something cold and sharp in my chest. Around us, the office had gone completely silent. Every person within earshot had heard Derek Morrison reduce me to nothing more than a coffee-fetching automaton. I looked him directly in the eyes, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Crystal clear, Mr. Morrison. Good. He turned to walk away, then paused. And get me a coffee. Black. The machine on this floor makes it too weak. As Derek disappeared back into his office, I became acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching me. Some faces showed sympathy, others embarrassment for what they'd witnessed, but a few, particularly among the male executives, showed something else entirely: satisfaction. As if Derek had finally put the uppity assistant in her place. I sat back down at my desk, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to focus on my computer screen, but my mind was racing. 3 years of this, 3 years of being treated like furniture, of having my ideas dismissed, of watching Derek take credit for work I'd done, 3 years of being just a secretary. That afternoon, I watched Derek stumble through his presentation to the board. He'd ignored my analysis entirely, presenting the Henderson acquisition as a golden opportunity. I sat in the back of the boardroom, taking notes as required, watching him make mistake after mistake. When board members asked pointed questions about the financial projections, Derek fumbled for answers I could have provided in my sleep. Richard Morrison, Derek's father, sat at the head of the table, his weathered face growing more concerned with each passing minute. At 72, Richard was still sharp as a razor, and I could see him recognizing the gaps in his son's presentation. Derek, Richard interrupted during a particularly painful moment, when Derek couldn't explain Henderson's debt structure. Do you have the detailed financial analysis, the breakdown of their current obligations? Derek's face went pale. The analysis is being finalized. By whom? Derek's eyes darted toward me briefly. My assistant is handling the additional research. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. Richard Morrison's gaze was particularly intense. Miss Chen, isn't it? I stood up slowly. Yes, sir. Do you have the analysis my son is referring to? This was it. The moment that would define everything that came next. I could play the role Derek had assigned me. The silent, invisible secretary who fetched coffee and filed papers. I could protect his reputation and maintain the status quo, or I could tell the truth. I do have a comprehensive analysis, Mr. Morris. However, I should clarify that it strongly advises against the acquisition. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Derek's face went from pale to red in seconds. Miss Chen, Richard said carefully, would you mind sharing your findings? I glanced at Derek, whose expression was pure fury. Then I looked back at Richard Morrison, a man who'd built an empire through careful decision-making and attention to detail. Henderson Industries appears profitable on the surface, but their accounting practices are questionable. They've been using aggressive revenue recognition to inflate their numbers, and their actual cash flow is negative. Additionally, they're facing 3 separate lawsuits that could result in damages exceeding their current market value. Acquiring them would expose Morrison and Associates to significant legal and financial liability. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Richard leaned forward. "Do you have documentation supporting these claims?" "Yes, sir. I've prepared a full report." I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a bound document I'd prepared but never expected to present. As I walked toward the front of the room, I caught Derek's eye. The look he gave me was pure venom, a promise of retribution that made my stomach clench. But I was past the point of no return now. Richard took the report and began flipping through it, his eyebrows rising with each page. After several minutes, he looked up at me. "This is exceptionally thorough work, Miss Chen. How long did this analysis take you?" "About 40 hours over the past 2 weeks. Sir, I completed it on my own time. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel." Now, back to where we left off. "On your own time," Richard repeated, his eyes shifting to his son. "Derek, were you aware that Miss Chen had prepared this analysis?" Derek's jaw was clenched so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. "She mentioned some concerns, but I felt they were overstated." Overstated. Richard's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Miss Chen, in your professional opinion, what would be the likely outcome if we proceeded with this acquisition?" I took a deep breath. "Conservative estimate, we'd lose between $50 and $70 million within the first year. Worst case scenario, it could trigger a cascade of legal issues that would threaten the entire company." The board members began murmuring among themselves. I could see the wheels turning in their heads as they processed what I'd just revealed. These were serious people with serious money at stake, and Derek had nearly led them off a financial cliff. Richard closed the report and looked directly at me. "Miss Chen, I'd like you to stay after this meeting. Everyone else, we'll table the Henderson discussion until we can review this analysis more thoroughly." As the board members filed out, Derek lingered behind, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. When the room was nearly empty, he approached. "You have no idea what you've just done," he whispered, his voice shaking with fury. "I've done my job," I replied quietly. "Your job is to support me, not undermine me in front of the board. My job is to support this company." And that's exactly what I did. Derek stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You're finished here, Jessica. I don't care what my father thinks of your little presentation. You're just a secretary who got too big for her britches, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." But Richard Morrison was still in the room, and he'd heard every word. "Derek," Richard's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I'd like to speak with you privately. Miss Chen, please wait outside." As I left the boardroom, I could hear raised voices through the thick oak door. Richard Morrison was not a man who tolerated incompetence, even from his own son. Especially from his own son. I sat in the hallway outside the boardroom, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline. What had I done? In the span of 30 minutes, I'd gone from invisible assistant to potential whistleblower. Derek would never forgive me for this. He'd make my life hell until I was forced to quit. But as I sat there, replaying the events of the day, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid anymore. For 3 years I'd been playing by Derek's rules, accepting his casual cruelty and professional dismissal. But that morning, when he'd called me just a secretary in front of the entire office, something had shifted inside me. I wasn't just a secretary. I was a woman with 2 degrees, 3 years of experience in high-level finance, and a mind sharp enough to spot problems that Derek Morrison couldn't see through his privilege and arrogance. The boardroom doors opened, and Derek emerged, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't look at me as he walked past, but I could see the defeat in his shoulders. Whatever Richard Morrison had said to him, it hadn't been pleasant. A moment later, Richard appeared in the doorway. "Miss Chen, could you join me? Please?" I walked back into the boardroom, my heart pounding. Richard Morrison was standing by the windows, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the polished conference table. "Sit down, please," he said without turning around. I took a seat, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. In 40 years of business, Richard said, finally turning to face me, I've learned that the most dangerous people in any organization are those who tell you what you want to hear rather than what you need to know. My son has been surrounded by yes men for so long that he's forgotten the difference. I remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. You, on the other hand, just saved this company from making a catastrophic mistake. The question is, what am I going to do about it? My mouth went dry. Sir? Richard Morrison smiled for the first time since I'd known him. Miss Chen, how would you feel about a promotion? The promotion Richard Morrison offered wasn't what I expected. Instead of moving me up within Derek's department, he created an entirely new position, senior financial analyst, reporting directly to him. The office came with it on the 46th floor, just one level below the executive suites, with a view of Pike Place Market and Puget Sound. But the real power wasn't in the title or the corner office, it was in the access. Richard Morrison had essentially made me his eyes and ears throughout the company, tasked with identifying inefficiencies, potential problems, and missed opportunities. In other words, I was now the person who could see everything Derek was doing wrong. The salary increase was substantial, from $65,000 to $120,000 annually, plus performance bonuses. But more importantly, Richard had given me something Derek never could respect. Within a week of my promotion, I was attending board meetings as a regular participant, not as someone taking notes in the back. Derek's reaction was exactly what I'd expected. The morning after my promotion was announced, I arrived at my new office to find him waiting outside my door, his face twisted with barely contained rage. Congratulations, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You must be very proud of yourself, stabbing me in the back like that. I unlocked my office door, noting how strange it felt to have my own key, my own space. I prevented you from making a mistake that would have cost the company millions. If you consider that a betrayal, then we have very different definitions of loyalty. Derek followed me into the office, closing the door behind him. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated the fury in his eyes. You think you're clever, don't you, playing the devoted employee while undermining me at every turn? But you're forgetting something important, Jessica. My name is on the building. This is my company, my legacy. You're just a temporary inconvenience. I set my briefcase down on the mahogany desk that came with the promotion and turned to face him full. Actually, Derek, your father's name is on the building, and this is his company. You just work here, same as me. The words hit their mark. Derek's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike me. Instead, he leaned across my desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've been planning my future in this company since I was 12 years old. I know every board member personally, every major client, every department. Do you think one good presentation changes anything? You're delusional. Maybe, I said, settling into my chair with a calm I didn't entirely feel. But I'm the one with the new office, and the direct line to your father. So I guess we'll see who's delusional. Derek straightened up, his expression shifting from rage to something more calculating. This isn't over, Jessica. Not by a long shot. After he left, I sat in the silence of my new office, processing what had just happened. Derek Morrison wasn't just angry. He was threatened men in positions of power were dangerous. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my new role with the dedication that had gotten me through college. Richard had given me broad authority to investigate any aspect of the company's operations, and what I discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. Morrison and Associates was profitable, but it was also incredibly inefficient. Derek's department alone was hemorrhaging money through poor decision-making, redundant processes, and what could only be described as corporate nepotism. 3 of his senior analysts were fraternity brothers from his college days at the University of Washington, hired not for their skills, but for their loyalty. Their combined salaries totaled nearly $400,000 annually, and their actual contributions to the company were minimal. But the real revelation came when I started digging into Derek's client relationship. Morrison and Associates managed portfolios for several high-net-worth individuals and small institutions, and Derek had been making decisions that benefited his personal interests rather than his client's best outcome. The most egregious example involved a client named Patricia Hendricks, a widowed retiree whose late husband had been Richard's college roommate. Derek had convinced her to invest heavily in a tech startup called NovaCorp, despite the company's questionable business model and inexperienced management team. What Derek hadn't disclosed was that he'd personally invested in NovaCorp and sat on their advisory board, a clear conflict of interest that violated both company policy and SEC regulations. Mrs. Hendricks had lost nearly $200,000 when NovaCorp went bankrupt 6 months earlier. Derek had managed to keep the loss quiet, absorbing it into the company's general fund to avoid scrutiny, but the documentation was all there in the files, waiting for someone with the right access and motivation to find it. I spent several evenings in my apartment in Capitol Hill surrounded by financial records and legal documents, building a comprehensive picture of Derek's misconduct. My cat, Mochi, seemed to sense the gravity of what I was doing, staying close as I worked late into the night. The question was what to do with the information. I could present it to Richard immediately, but that felt like overplaying my hand. Derek was still his son, and family loyalty ran deep in the Morrison bloodline. I needed to be strategic, patient. The opportunity came 3 weeks later, during the company's annual Client Appreciation Gala at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. The event was Morrison and Associates' biggest social gathering of the year, a chance for Richard to schmooze with clients, and Derek to play the role of heir apparent. I'd never attended the gala before. Executive assistants weren't typically invited to such events, but as senior financial analyst, I was now part of the inner circle. I'd bought a black cocktail dress from Nordstrom, something elegant but not too flashy, and arrived at the hotel feeling like an imposter in expensive clothes. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Olympic Mountain. Seattle's financial elite mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvres, discussing market trends and investment strategies with the casual confidence of people who'd never worried about money. Derek was in his element, working the room with practiced charm. He'd brought a date, a blonde woman in her early 20s who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. I later learned she was Madison Wells, a local news anchor who'd been linked to several prominent Seattle businessmen over the past year. I was nursing a glass of wine near the bar when Richard Morrison approached me. At 72, he still commanded attention wherever he went, his presence filling the room even when he spoke quietly. "Jessica, I'm glad you could make it. How are you settling into your new role?" "Very well, thank you. I've been conducting the comprehensive review you requested." Richard's eyes sharpened with interest. "And what have you found?" This was it, the moment I'd been preparing for. "There are some areas that need attention. Perhaps we could schedule a private meeting to discuss the details." "Of course, but give me the executive summary. What's the biggest concern?" I glanced around the crowded ballroom, ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. "Client portfolio management, specifically, conflicts of interest that could expose the company to regulatory scrutiny." Richard's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. "I see. How serious are we talking?" "Serious enough that we need to address it immediately." Before Richard could respond, Derek materialized beside us, Madison Wells clinging to his arm like an expensive accessory. "Dad, Jessica, what are you two discussing so intently? You look like you're planning a hostile takeover." Derek's laugh was forced, his eyes darting between us nervously. "Just business, son. Nothing that can't wait until Monday." Richard's voice was neutral, but I caught the subtle warning in his tone. "Well, don't let work ruin the party," Derek said, his grip tightening on Madison's waist. "Madison, have you met our rising star? This is Jessica Chen. She recently got promoted from my assistant to—" "What's your title again?" "Jessica." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He was trying to diminish me in front of his father and his date, reminding everyone that I'd once been beneath him in the corporate hierarchy. "Senior financial analyst," I replied evenly. "I will report directly to your father now." Madison smiled politely, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was clearly trying to assess the power dynamics at play. "How wonderful," she said in a voice that suggested she found it anything but wonderful. "Derek tells me you're very thorough in your work." I try to be comprehensive, yes. Derek's smile became more strained. "Jessica has a talent for finding problems where others see opportunities. It's quite remarkable, really. Problems have a way of becoming disasters if they're ignored," I replied. "I prefer to address them early." The tension between Derek and me was palpable. Even as we maintained our polite facades, Richard watched the exchange with growing interest, clearly recognizing that there was more going on than casual conversation. "Well," Derek said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "some people see problems everywhere because they're naturally suspicious. It's a shame. Really, success requires optimism, vision, the ability to see potential where others see obstacles, and failure often comes from ignoring red flags because you're too optimistic to see them," I countered. Madison looked uncomfortable with the increasingly hostile exchange. "Perhaps we should rejoin the party," she suggested, tugging gently on Derek's arm. "Excellent idea," Richard interjected. "Derek, why don't you introduce Madison to the Castellets? They're always interested in meeting new people." As Derek and Madison moved away, Richard turned back to me. "Monday morning, 8 o'clock, my office, bring everything." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of networking and small talk. I found myself in conversations with clients I'd only known as names on reports, learning about their concerns and expectations for their investment. It was fascinating to see the human faces behind the numbers I analyzed daily, but throughout the evening, I was aware of Derek watching me. He'd position himself across the room and stare, his expression growing darker with each passing hour. By the time the gala ended, the pretense of politeness had worn thin. As guests began to leave, I found myself alone on the hotel's outdoor terrace, looking out at Elliott Bay. The October air was crisp and I'd wrapped my pashmina around my shoulders to ward off the chill, enjoying the view. I turned to find Derek approaching, his bow tie undone, and his jacket draped over his arm. Madison was nowhere to be seen. "It's beautiful," I said carefully. "Seattle really is a magnificent city." Derek joined me at the railing, standing closer than necessary. "You know, Jessica, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, about the future of this company." "Oh?" "My father is getting older. He's starting to make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Take your promotion, for example. He promoted you because he was impressed by one presentation, not because you have the experience or judgment to handle senior-level responsibilities." I turned to face him fully. "Is that your professional assessment?" Derek's laugh was cold. "My professional assessment is that you're in over your head. You're playing games you don't understand with people who have been in this business longer than you've been alive." "And what games are those, Derek?" "The game of corporate politics, the game of family loyalty, the game of knowing when to push and when to back down." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You've been pushing very hard lately, Jessica, but you're forgetting something important, which is, I'm not going anywhere. This company will be mine someday, whether my father likes it or not. And when that day comes, I have a very long memory." The threat was unmistakable, but instead of fear I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Derek Morrison thought he could intimidate me into submission, just as he'd done for 3 years when I was his assistant, but I wasn't that person anymore. "You're right about one thing, Derek. Corporate politics is a game, but you're wrong about who's playing it better." I started to walk away, but Derek grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin through the fabric of my dress. "Don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you. Let go of me, now, or what? You'll run to my father, tell him his son was mean to you at the company party." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. "Derek, if you don't remove your hand from my arm in the next 3 seconds, I'm going to scream, and then I'm going to explain to everyone who comes running exactly why you felt the need to physically restrain me on a hotel terrace." For a moment, we stared at each other in silence. Then Derek released my arm, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This isn't over," he said. "No," I agreed, "it's not." As I walked back into the hotel, I realized that the war between Derek Morrison and me had officially begun, and unlike the skirmishes we'd had in the office, this battle would determine not just my future at Morrison and Associates, but the future of the company itself. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning arrived with the kind of Seattle drizzle that makes everything look gray and ominous. I arrived at the office at 7:30, carrying a leather portfolio that contained enough evidence to end Derek Morrison's career. The building felt different somehow, quieter, more tense, as if everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. Richard Morrison's office occupied the entire northwest corner of the 47th floor. I'd only been inside twice before, both times as Derek's silent assistant, taking notes. Now, as I knocked on the mahogany door at exactly 8 o'clock, I was entering as an equal. "Come in, Jessica." Richard was standing behind his desk, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay. The morning light filtered through the clouds, casting long shadows across the Persian rug that covered most of the office floor. "Please, sit down," he gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Coffee?" "Thank you. That would be great." As Richard poured coffee from an ornate silver service, I arranged my documents on the small table beside my chair. The evidence was organized chronologically, each violation meticulously documented with supporting paperwork. "You mentioned conflicts of interest," Richard said, settling into his chair with his own cup. "Tell me what you found." I opened the portfolio and pulled out the first set of documents. "The most serious issue involves Patricia Hendrick. Derek convinced her to invest $200,000 in NovaCorp, a tech startup that failed 6 months later. What he didn't disclose was his personal investment in the company, and his position on their advisory board." Richard's expression remained neutral, but I noticed his grip tighten on his coffee cup. "Go on." "The investment violated our conflict of interest policies and SEC regulations regarding disclosure. When NovaCorp went bankrupt, Derek used company funds to partially cover Mrs. Hendrick's losses, disguising it as a discretionary bonus to avoid questions. I handed him copies of the investment documents, bank records, and internal memos. Richard studied them carefully, his weathered face growing more grim with each page. "How much did the company absorb?" $80,000. Derek told Mrs. Hendricks it was an insurance payout. Richard set down the documents and rubbed his temples. "What else?" "There are 3 other instances of undisclosed conflicts, totaling nearly $300,000 in client losses, and there's a pattern of preferential treatment for his personal friends who work in the department." I spent the next 20 minutes walking Richard through each violation, each breach of fiduciary duty, each instance where Derek had put his personal interests ahead of his client's welfare. By the time I finished, the coffee in both our cups had grown cold. Richard stood up and walked to the windows, his hands clasped behind his back. For several minutes, the only sound in the office was the distant hum of traffic from the street below. "Jessica," he said finally, "do you understand what you're asking me to do?" "I'm not asking you to do anything, Mr. Morrison. I'm simply reporting what I found during my investigation." "You're asking me to destroy my son's career." The words hung in the air between us. I chose my response carefully. "I'm asking you to protect your company and your client. What you do with that information is your decision." Richard turned around, his face etched with the weight of a father's impossible choice. "Derek is my only child. When I'm gone, he's supposed to carry on what I've built." "With respect, sir, if Derek continues on his current path, there won't be anything left to carry on." The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. Then Richard walked back to his desk and picked up his phone. "Margaret, please ask Derek to come to my office immediately." As we waited for Derek to arrive, Richard paced behind his desk like a caged animal. I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap, trying to project calm confidence despite the butterflies in my stomach. Derek arrived within minutes, his face flushed from what I assumed was a hurried trip up from the 45th floor. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, but his tie was slightly askew, and there was a coffee stain on his shirt that he'd tried to hide with his jacket. "Dad, you wanted to see me." "Sit down, Derek." Something in Richard's tone made Derek hesitate. His eyes darted to me, then back to his father as if trying to gauge the situation. Is this about the Henderson deal? Because I've been reconsidering our position on that, and I think, sit down. Derek sat, but his posture remained defensive. What's this about? Richard walked around his desk and perched on the edge, looking down at his son. I want you to tell me about Patricia Hendricks. The color drained from Derek's face. What about her? Her investment in Novacorp, your role in that investment, and what happened when the company failed. Derek's eyes flicked to me, and I saw the exact moment when he realized I'd exposed him. His face cycled through several emotions: surprise, anger, fear, and finally, calculation. Dad, I can explain. I'm sure you can, but first I want you to explain this. Richard picked up one of the documents from my portfolio and handed it to Derek. This is a bank record showing an $80,000 transfer from our discretionary fund to Patricia's account, labeled as insurance settlement. What insurance, Derek? Derek stared at the document, his hands trembling slightly. When he looked up, his expression had hardened into something ugly. She told you, didn't she? He pointed at me accusingly. Jessica's been digging through confidential files trying to make me look bad. The files aren't confidential from me, Derek. I own this company, but they're confidential from her. Derek stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. She has no right to access client records to investigate my department. This is a witch hunt. Richard's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Jessica is doing exactly what I asked her to do. She's conducting a comprehensive review of our operation. What she found in your department is concerning. Derek began pacing, his movements jerky and agitated. Concerning, Dad, this is corporate espionage. She's trying to sabotage me because I hurt her feelings. This is revenge, pure and simple, is it? Richard picked up another document. This is an email from you to Novacorp CEO, discussing your personal investment in the company. It's dated 3 days before you recommended the investment to Patricia. How is that revenge? Derek stopped pacing, his face flushed with anger and desperation. Every investment carries risk. Patricia understood that, and the Novacorp deal looked solid at the time. Did you disclose your personal interest in the company? The disclosure wasn't necessary. My investment was minimal. $50,000 is minimal. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. How did you? He whirled around to face me. You had no right to access my personal financial records. I didn't, I said quietly. Your personal investment information was in the Novacorp files, which were part of Patricia's investment documentation. Richard stood up from his desk. Derek, you violated SEC regulations, company policy, and your fiduciary duty to a client. Then you used company funds to cover your mistake without proper authorization. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? What have I done? Derek's voice rose to nearly a shout. What about what she's done? She's been undermining me for months. First the Henderson presentation, now this. She's trying to destroy me. The Henderson presentation saved us from losing millions of dollars, and this investigation revealed serious compliance violations that could have resulted in regulatory action against the entire firm. Derek looked back and forth between his father and me, his face contorted with rage. I see what this is. You're choosing her over me, your own son. I'm choosing the company over personal relationships, just as you should have done. The company, Derek laughed bitterly. This company is my birthright. I've worked my entire life to earn my place here, and you're going to let some secretary destroy everything I've built. The word secretary hung in the air like a slap. Richard's expression darkened. Jessica is not a secretary. She's a senior analyst who's demonstrated more integrity and competence in the past month than you've shown in the past year. Derek's composure finally cracked completely. Integrity. She's a backstabbing opportunist who's been plotting against me since day one, and you're too blind to see. What I see, Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, is a young woman who prevented this company from making a catastrophic mistake, and uncovered serious misconduct that could have resulted in criminal charges. Criminal charges. Derek went pale. Dad, you can't be serious. This is a family business. We protect each other. We protect the business, Derek, and right now, you're the biggest threat to its survival. The office fell silent.
except for the sound of Derek's labored breathing. I remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile tension in the room. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice hollow. "What happens now?"
Richard walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. "You're going to take a leave of absence while we conduct a full audit of your department. You'll cooperate completely with the investigation. And you'll personally apologize to Patricia Hendricks and any other clients who were affected by your actions. And if I refuse, then you'll be terminated for cause, and I'll refer the matter to the SEC for criminal prosecution." Derek stared at his father for a long moment, then turned his gaze to me. The hatred in his eyes was so intense it made my skin crawl. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started." "Derek," Richard began, but his son was already heading for the door. "I'll clean out my office," Derek said without turning around. But this conversation isn't finished. After Derek left, Richard and I sat in silence for several minutes. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and my hands were shaking despite my efforts to remain composed. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," Richard said finally. "I'm sorry it was necessary." Richard stood up and walked to the windows again. "Derek is my son, and I love him, but he's also a liability that I can no longer ignore. What will happen to him? That depends on him. If he cooperates with the audit and makes restitution to the affected clients, we might be able to keep this internal. If he fights us," Richard's voice trailed off, "and the department, you'll be taking over Derek's responsibilities on an interim basis. Consider it a trial run for a permanent promotion." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Sir?" Richard turned around, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You wanted to move beyond being just a secretary, didn't you? Congratulations, Jessica. You're now the acting head of client portfolio management." As I left Richard's office an hour later, carrying a new set of keys and access codes, I felt a mixture of triumph and apprehension. I'd achieved something I'd never dared to dream of: real power within the company, the respect of the owner, and the authority to make meaningful changes. But I'd also made an enemy of Derek Morrison, and his parting words echoed in my mind. "This isn't over." As I walked past Derek's former office, I could see him through the glass walls, packing his personal belongings into cardboard boxes. He looked up as I passed, and our eyes met for a brief moment. The expression on his face wasn't defeat. It was pure, calculating hatred. I had won this battle, but I had a feeling the war was just beginning. The first indication that Derek wasn't going quietly came 3 days after his forced leave of absence. I was settling into his former office, now mine, when my assistant, Marcus Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, knocked on my door with a troubled expression. "Jessica, we have a problem. 3 major clients have called this morning, requesting immediate meetings about their portfolios. They all mentioned receiving concerning information about recent management changes." I looked up from the client files I'd been reviewing. "What kind of information?" Marcus closed the door behind him and lowered his voice. "Apparently someone has been telling them that the company is in financial trouble and that their investments might be at risk." The calls all came within an hour of each other. My stomach dropped. "Who called them? They won't but the timing is suspicious, and the information they received was specific enough to be credible. Someone with inside knowledge is trying to spook our clients." I leaned back in my chair, processing the implication. Derek had access to client contact information and intimate knowledge of their concerns and investment histories. He could easily craft messages designed to maximize panic while staying just shy of outright lies. "Schedule the meetings for this afternoon," I said. "All 3 of them, and document everything. If someone is deliberately trying to sabotage our client relationships, we need a paper trail." The first meeting was with Thomas Brighton, a retired Boeing executive, who'd entrusted Morrison and Associates with his $3.2 million retirement portfolio. Brighton was a methodical man, who'd built his wealth through careful planning and conservative investing. The fact that he was panicking enough to demand an emergency meeting was deeply concerning. "Jessica," Brighton said as he settled into the chair across from my desk, "I received some disturbing information yesterday. Is it true that Derek Morrison has been suspended for mismanaging client funds? I chose my words carefully. Derek is taking a temporary leave of absence while we conduct a routine audit of department procedures. This is a precautionary measure to ensure all our clients receive the highest level of service. Brighton's eyes narrowed. That's not what I heard. My source told me that Derek was caught stealing from client accounts, and that the company is trying to cover it up to avoid a scandal. The accusation was so specific and inflammatory that it had to have come from Derek himself. He was weaponizing partial truths and spinning them into career-ending lies. Mr. Brighton, I can assure you that no client funds have been stolen or misappropriated. Your portfolio has actually outperformed the market by 12% over the past year. But what about this Patricia Hendricks situation? I heard she lost everything, and that the company paid her off to keep quiet. I pulled up Brighton's account on my computer, buying time to formulate a response. Whoever had contacted him, almost certainly Derek, had provided just enough accurate details to make the story believable while twisting the facts beyond recognition. Mrs. Hendricks experienced a loss on a single investment that didn't perform as expected. This is a normal part of portfolio management, and she was fully informed of the risks involved. No payoff was necessary because no wrongdoing occurred. Brighton wasn't entirely convinced, but after reviewing his portfolio performance and discussing his investment strategy for the next quarter, he was somewhat reassured. The other two meetings followed a similar pattern. Clients armed with just enough information to be worried, but not enough to understand the full context. By the end of the day, I was exhausted and furious. Derek was conducting a systematic campaign to destroy client confidence in the company, using his inside knowledge to maximum effect, but proving it would be nearly impossible unless we caught him in the act. That evening, I was working late in my office when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Jessica Chen. Hello, Jessica. Working late again? The voice was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. Madison Wells, Derek's girlfriend from the gala. Madison, how did you get this number? Derek gave it to me. He thought we should talk. I leaned back in my chair, instantly alert. About what? About the situation you've created. Derek is devastated by what's happened. He trusted you, considered you a valuable member of his team, and you betrayed that trust. The audacity was breathtaking. Madison, I'm not sure you understand the full situation. I understand perfectly. You saw an opportunity to advance your career by destroying Derek's reputation, and you took it. Now his father won't even speak to him. Derek destroyed his own reputation by violating SEC regulations and company policy. I simply documented what I found. Madison's laugh was cold. You sound very self-righteous for someone who built their career on lies and manipulation. Excuse me. Derek told me about your background, Jessica, about the corners you cut to get where you are. The false references, the exaggerated qualifications, the way you ingratiate yourself with his father by feeding him information about Derek's personal life. Each accusation was a complete fabrication, but they were delivered with such confidence that for a moment, I wondered if Madison actually believed them. Everything you just said is false, and you know it. Then you won't mind if Derek shares his concerns with the appropriate authorities. The Washington State Bar Association might be very interested in hearing about your fraudulent academic credentials. The threat was absurd. I'd graduated summa cum laude from Washington State University with degrees in business and finance, but I realized that Derek was playing a longer game than I'd anticipated. He wasn't just trying to sabotage my current position. He was trying to destroy my entire professional future. Madison, I'm going to hang up now. If Derek has specific allegations to make, he can direct them through proper channels. This conversation isn't over, Jessica. Derek has friends in this city. Powerful friends who don't appreciate outsiders trying to disrupt established families. You might want to consider whether this job is worth the consequences. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. Derek wasn't just angry. He was building a campaign of character assassination designed to drive me out of Seattle entirely. The next morning brought fresh evidence of Derek's strategy. I arrived at the office to find an email from our company's IT department, informing me that someone had attempted to access my personnel files remotely. The logging attempt had failed, but the IP address traced back to a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, the same neighborhood where Derek lived. Then Marcus informed me that 2 more clients had called with questions about rumors they'd heard about the company's financial stability. Both clients mentioned receiving anonymous tips about management turmoil and regulatory investigations. By noon, I'd had enough. I called Richard Morrison and requested an immediate meeting. Derek is conducting a coordinated campaign to sabotage our client relationships, I told Richard, spreading printouts of the IT logs and client communications across his desk. He's spreading false information designed to create panic and force clients to withdraw their accounts. Richard studied the documents, his face growing darker with each page. This is unconscionable. He's willing to destroy the company to get back at you. It's worse than that. Last night his girlfriend called me with threats about exposing supposed fraud in my background. They're not just trying to undermine my position, they're trying to destroy my career entirely. Richard stood up and walked to his phone. Margaret, get Derek on the line immediately. I don't care where he is or what he's doing. While we waited for the call to connect, Richard paced behind his desk like a caged lion. 40 years I've spent building this company's reputation. 40 years of careful relationship management, ethical practices, and client service. And my own son is willing to burn it all down out of spite. The phone rang and Richard snatched it up. Derek, we need to talk. Now. I couldn't hear Derek's response, but I could see Richard's face growing redder with each passing second. I don't care if you're busy. You have exactly 1 hour to get to my office, or I'm calling the SEC myself. Richard slammed down the phone and turned to me. He's coming, and this ends today. While we waited, Richard made several calls to the clients who'd expressed concerns, personally guaranteeing the stability of their investments and inviting them to review their portfolio performance with me directly. His reputation in the Seattle financial community was sterling, and his personal assurances carried significant weight. Derek arrived 53 minutes later, looking disheveled and defiant. His usually perfect hair was unkempt, and his clothes looked like he'd slept in them. But his eyes still held that calculating hatred I'd seen in his office days earlier. Dad, this is harassment. I'm on medical leave, remember? Stress-related exhaustion brought on by workplace persecution. Sit down, Derek. I'll stand. Thanks. What's this about? Richard handed him copies of the IT logs and client communication summaries. This is about you deliberately sabotaging client relationships and attempting to access confidential personnel files. Derek glanced at the documents with feigned confusion. I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. We have IP addresses, timestamps, and corroborating phone records. You've been conducting a systematic campaign to undermine this company. Prove it. Derek's voice was calm, but I could see his hands trembling slightly. Prove that I made those calls or accessed those systems. You have circumstantial evidence at best. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I don't need proof for a criminal court, Derek. I need evidence sufficient to terminate your employment and prevent you from working in this industry ever again. You wouldn't dare. I'm your son. You're an employee who's violating the terms of his leave agreement and actively working to destroy the company. The family relationship ended the moment you decided your personal vendetta was more important than 40 years of family legacy. Derek's composure finally cracked. Family legacy? What family legacy? You built this company for yourself. Not for me. Everything I've done has been to try to live up to your impossible standards, and it's never been enough. Living up to my standards would have meant putting the company first, treating clients with respect, and maintaining the ethical practices that built our reputation. Instead, you've demonstrated that you're willing to sacrifice everything for your own ego. My ego? Derek pointed at me accusingly. She's the one with the ego problem. She thinks she can waltz in here with her degrees and her ambition and take over everything I've worked for. What have you worked for? Richard's voice rose to match his son's. You've worked for 3 years to nearly destroy everything I built. Jessica has done more to protect this company in 1 month than you've done in your entire career. Derek turned his full attention to me, his face contorted with rage. You think you've won, don't you? You think you can destroy my relationship with my father and take my place in this company? I met his gaze steadily. I think I've exposed the truth about your conduct and protected the company from further damage. What happens next is up to your father. The truth? Derek laughed bitterly. The truth is that you're an opportunistic climber who saw a chance to advance your career, and took it, regardless of who you had to destroy along the way. The truth, Richard interjected, is that Jessica prevented you from making decisions that would have cost this company millions of dollars and exposed us to criminal liability. The truth is that she's demonstrated more integrity and competence than you've shown in years. Derek stared at his father for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't identify. Finally he spoke, his voice deadly quiet. Fine, you want her, you can have her, but don't think this is over. I still have friends in this city, connections you can't imagine, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you've chosen to replace me. But Derek was already heading for the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back at me one final time. Enjoy your moment, Jessica, because that's all it's going to be. After Derek left, Richard and I sat in silence for several minutes. The confrontation had been uglier than I'd expected, and Derek's final words carried an ominous promise of escalation. I'm sorry you had to see that, Richard said finally. I'm sorry it was necessary. Richard walked to his window and stared out at the Seattle skyline. Derek is no longer an employee of this company. As of today, his access to all systems and client information has been revoked. Security will escort him from the building if he tries to return. The finality of the statement hit me like a physical blow. Derek Morrison, heir to the Morrison and Associates empire, had just been permanently exiled from his own family business. What happens now? I asked. Richard turned around, his expression grim but determined. Now we rebuild, and we prepare for whatever Derek has planned next. Derek's exile from Morrison and Associates lasted exactly 6 days before his true campaign began. I should have expected it. Men like Derek Morrison don't simply disappear when their privilege is threatened. They adapt, they network, and they strike back from positions you never saw coming. The first sign came on a Thursday evening, when I was having dinner at Canlis with my college friend Sarah Kim, who worked as a prosecutor for the King County District Attorney's Office. We were catching up over wine and Pacific Northwest salmon when Sarah's expression suddenly grew serious. Jessica, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course. What's wrong? Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. I had a very strange conversation today with someone from the Washington State Securities Division. They mentioned your name in connection with an investigation. My fork clattered against my plate. What kind of investigation? Securities fraud. Specifically allegations that you've been manipulating client portfolios for personal gain. Sarah's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the concern in her eyes. The investigator said, they received a detailed complaint from a former Morrison and Associates employee. The restaurant suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. Derek had escalated beyond corporate sabotage. He was trying to have me criminally prosecuted. Sarah, everything they've been told is false. Derek Morrison was terminated for violating SEC regulations, and now he's trying to frame me for his own misconduct. I believe you, Sarah said immediately, but Jessica, whoever filed this complaint provided extensive documentation, bank records, email communications, client transaction histories. It's sophisticated enough that the state is taking it seriously. I spent the rest of dinner explaining the entire situation to Sarah, from Derek's conflicts of interest to his systematic campaign of client intimidation. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on her phone. This is ugly, she said as we prepared to leave. Derek has essentially accused you of everything he was actually doing, but he's done it with enough detail and supporting evidence to make it credible. Even if you're eventually cleared, the investigation process could destroy your career. That weekend, I barely slept. Every phone call could be a summons from investigators. Every knock on my apartment door could be federal agents with search warrants. Derek had weaponized the legal system against me, and there was nothing I could do but wait for the investigation to unfold. Monday morning brought another unpleasant surprise. I arrived at the office to find Marcus waiting with a stack of resignation letters from 3 junior analysts in my department. They all cite concerns about working under someone who's under criminal investigation. Marcus explained. Apparently, word has gotten out about the securities fraud allegations. I sat down heavily in my chair, feeling the walls closing in. How did they find out?
The investigation hasn't been made public. LinkedIn, Marcus said grimly.
Someone created a fake account and started sending private messages to Morrison and Associates employees, warning them about working with you. The messages included links to what appear to be official government documents. I pulled up LinkedIn on my computer and searched for mentions of my name. Sure enough, there were several fake profiles, all created within the past week, that had been systematically contacting current and former Morrison and Associates employees with concerns about my conduct. The fake documents were masterful forgeries. They looked like official SEC letterhead, complete with case numbers and investigator contact information. To anyone without legal experience, they would appear completely authentic. "Derek's not working alone," I said, studying the sophisticated disinformation campaign. "This level of coordination requires help, professional help." Marcus nodded. "I did some digging. Turns out Derek's been hanging around with Cameron Walsh lately." The name sent a chill down my spine. Cameron Walsh was a former Morrison and Associates client, who'd been fired 2 years earlier for attempting to bribe a city councilman. He'd started his own crisis management firm that specialized in what he euphemistically called reputation. In reality, Walsh was known for using intimidation, blackmail and character assassination to destroy his clients' enemies. "Jessica," Marcus said carefully, "maybe you should consider taking a leave of absence until this blows over. The investigation will clear you eventually, but in the meantime..." "No," the word came out sharper than I'd intended. "I'm not going to let Derek Morrison drive me out of my own career. If he wants a war, he'll get one." But privately I was terrified. Derek and Walsh had resources I couldn't match. Family money, political connections, and a willingness to use tactics that would never occur to someone who'd been raised to follow the rules. That afternoon, I received a call from Patricia Hendricks, the client whose Nova Corp losses had triggered Derek's downfall. Her voice was shaky, and she sounded much older than her 73 years. "Jessica, dear, I received the most disturbing phone call yesterday. Someone claiming to be from the government said that you'd been stealing money from my account." My heart sank. "Mrs. Hendricks, that's completely false. Can you tell me exactly what they said?" "They said you'd been moving money out of client accounts into your personal investments, and that I should demand an immediate audit of my portfolio. They gave me a phone number to call if I wanted to file a complaint." I spent 20 minutes walking Miss Hendricks through her account history, showing her that every transaction had been properly documented, and that her portfolio had actually grown significantly under my management. But I could hear the doubt in her voice, the seed of suspicion that Derek's allies had planted. After the call, I realized that Derek's strategy was more sophisticated than simple revenge. He was systematically destroying my credibility with clients, colleagues, and regulatory authorities simultaneously. Even if I survived the criminal investigation, my reputation in the Seattle financial community would be permanently damaged. That evening, I was working late when Richard Morrison appeared in my doorway. He looked exhausted, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. "Jessica, we need to talk." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I assume you've heard about the investigation." Richard nodded grimly. "The SEC called me this morning. They're conducting a formal inquiry into allegations of securities fraud and client account manipulation. Everything they've been told is false. Derek is trying to frame me for his own misconduct. I know that, and you know that, but the SEC doesn't know that, and they have a duty to investigate credible allegations." Richard rubbed his temples, looking every one of his 72 years. "Jessica, I've been in this business for 40 years, and I've never seen a more comprehensive character assassination campaign." "What do you mean?" "Derek hasn't just filed complaints with the SEC. He's also contacted the Better Business Bureau, the Washington State Attorney General's office, and the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. He's created a paper trail that makes you look like the most corrupt financial advisor in the Pacific Northwest." The scope of Derek's campaign was breathtaking. He wasn't just trying to get me fired. He was trying to make me unemployable anywhere in the financial industry. "There's more," Richard continued. "I received a call from Judge Patricia Chen this afternoon." My blood went cold. Judge Chen was my cousin, a respected federal judge.
who'd been appointed to the bench 5 years earlier. We weren't particularly close, but we moved in overlapping social circles within Seattle's Asian American professional community. What did she want? She wanted to warn me that someone had been asking questions about your family background, your immigration status, your academic credentials, professional investigators, the kind that charge $500 a day. The room felt like it was spinning. Derek wasn't just attacking my professional reputation, he was investigating my entire life, looking for any detail that could be weaponized against me. Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Of course, am I putting this company at risk by staying? Would it be better for Morrison and Associates if I resigned? Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. Jessica, in 40 years of business, I've learned to judge people by their actions, not by the accusations made against them. Your actions have saved this company millions of dollars and protected our clients from significant losses. Derek's actions have nearly destroyed everything I've spent my career building. But the investigation will clear you completely, because you've done nothing wrong. In the meantime, I'm not going to let my son's vendetta drive away the most competent financial analyst this company has ever employed. Richard stood up and walked to my desk. There's something else you should know. I've hired Blackwater Security to provide personal protection for you. Personal protection? Richard, that seems Derek is no longer just angry. Jessica, he's desperate. Desperate. Desperate men with unlimited resources and questionable associates do unpredictable things. I'm not taking any chances with your safety. As if summoned by Richard's words, a tall woman in a dark suit appeared in my doorway. She had the bearing of a former military, and her eyes constantly scanned the room even as she spoke. Miss Chen, I'm Agent Sarah Martinez from Blackwater Security. I'll be coordinating your protection details starting immediately. The surreal nature of the situation hit me like a physical blow. 6 months ago, I'd been Derek Morrison's invisible assistant, filing papers and fetching coffee. Now I needed bodyguards to protect me from his retribution. Is this really necessary? I asked. Agent Martinez's expression was professional but serious. Ma'am, in the past week you've been the target of a sophisticated disinformation campaign, criminal complaints and private investigation. The escalation pattern suggests that whoever is behind this is prepared to go to significant lengths to achieve their objectives. That night, I sat in my Capitol Hill apartment with Agent Martinez stationed outside my door, reviewing the events that had brought me to this point. Derek's transformation from petulant boss to dangerous enemy had been swift and complete, but what frightened me most wasn't his willingness to destroy my career. It was his apparent belief that he could get away with it. Men like Derek Morrison had spent their entire lives learning that consequences were for other people. Rules, laws, professional ethics. These were obstacles to be circumvented rather than boundaries to be respected. And when their privilege was threatened, they didn't retreat. They escalated. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Still think you've won. This is just the beginning. A friend.
I showed the message to Agent Martinez, who immediately began tracing the number. But I already knew who'd sent it, and I knew that Derek's promise of escalation was about to be fulfilled. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Marcus burst into my office with a copy of the Seattle Business Journal, his face pale with shock. Jessica, you need to see this. The headline read, Morrison and Associates under investigation for securities fraud. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and selective quotation, painting the company as a corrupt organization that had been exploiting clients for years. My name was mentioned prominently as the subject of a criminal investigation, with quotes from former employees expressing shock at my alleged misconduct. But the most damaging element was a sidebar article titled, The Rise and Fall of Jessica Chen, which detailed my meteoric rise from secretary to department head, and suggested that such rapid advancement could only be explained by illegal activity. The articles had clearly been planted by Derek's team, probably through Cameron Walsh's media connections, but they were written cleverly enough to avoid obvious libel, presenting allegations as established facts while maintaining plausible deniability. My phone started ringing immediately. Clients demanding explanations, reporters seeking comments, competitors expressing a fake concern about the situation at Morrison & Associates. Within hours, the story had spread throughout Seattle's financial community like wildfire. Richard called an emergency board meeting for that afternoon. As I walked into the boardroom, I could see the uncertainty in the board members' faces. These were serious people with serious money at stake, and they weren't going to tolerate any hint of scandal. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, "I'm sure you've all seen this morning's news coverage. I want to address these allegations directly and provide you with the facts behind this manufactured controversy." For the next hour, Richard methodically dismantled Derek's accusations, presenting evidence of his son's actual misconduct, while documenting my role in protecting the company's interests. The board listened in stony silence, occasionally asking pointed questions about the SEC investigation and its potential impact on the firm's reputation. When Richard finished, board member Helen Castellano, a 70-year-old former banking executive, spoke first. "Richard, while we appreciate your confidence in Miss Chen, the reality is that this controversy is already affecting our business. 3 clients have called me personally expressing concerns about their investment. The concerns are based on false information planted by Derek and his associates." Richard replied, "Once the investigation is complete, Jessica will be completely vindicated. But how long will that take?" asked board member Michael Foster. "And how much damage will we sustain in the meantime?" The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Even if I was eventually cleared, the investigation and media coverage could drive away clients and destroy the company's reputation. Finally, Richard spoke, "I'm going to ask Jessica to address you directly." I stood up slowly, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine not just my future, but the future of everyone employed by Morrison & Associates. "Ladies and gentlemen, 6 months ago I was Derek Morrison's assistant, content to work behind the scenes and support this company's mission. I never sought the spotlight, and I certainly never wanted to be the center of a controversy." I paused, making eye contact with each board member. But when I discovered that Derek's actions were putting this company and its clients at risk, I had a choice. I could stay silent and protect my own position, or I could do what was right and expose the truth. I chose to protect this company, knowing full well that Derek would retaliate. I walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Everything Derek has accused me of, he actually did himself. Every allegation against me is a projection of his own misconduct, and every attack on my character is an attempt to distract from his own failure. I turned back to face the board. "I understand if you decide that I'm more trouble than I'm worth, but I want you to know that I've given everything I have to protect this company, and I'll continue fighting to clear my name and preserve what Richard Morrison has built." The boardroom was silent for several long moments. Then Helen Castellano spoke. "Miss Chen, what you've described is a level of dedication that this company values highly. However, the practical reality is that this controversy is affecting our business relationship." My heart sank, but Helen continued. "Therefore, the board has decided to publicly support you while this investigation proceeds. We're going to fight this together." The relief was overwhelming, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. Derek had declared war not just on me, but on the entire Morrison family legacy, and I was about to learn just how far he was willing to go to win. The board's support gave me strength, but it also painted an even bigger target on my back. Within hours of the meeting, Derek's campaign shifted into overdrive. If he couldn't force me out through intimidation, he was going to try to destroy everything I cared about. The next attack came from an unexpected direction. On Friday morning, I received a call from Elizabeth Morrison, Richard's wife and Derek's mother. I'd met her only twice, both times at company holiday parties where she'd been polite but distant. Now her voice carried a mixture of desperation and barely controlled anger. "Jessica, I need to see you immediately. Can you come to my home this afternoon?" "Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Is everything all right?" "No, everything is not all right. My family is being destroyed and I need to understand why." The Morrison family estate sat on 3 acres of waterfront property in Medina, just across Lake Washington from Seattle. The house was a sprawling Tudor mansion that screamed old money and established power. As I pulled through the wrought iron gates, I couldn't help but think about the contrast between this world and the modest apartment I'd grown up in. Dr. Morrison met me at the front door herself, which surprised me. I'd expected household staff, but she was alone. At 68, Elizabeth Morrison was still an elegant woman, but today she looked exhausted and fragile. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading me into a living room that could have housed my entire apartment. "Can I offer you tea? That would be lovely. Thank you." As she prepared the tea service, I studied the family photographs that covered every surface. Derek as a child at various exclusive schools, family vacations in Europe, formal portraits that documented decades of privilege and comfort. But what struck me was how few recent photos there were, as if the family had stopped creating happy memories sometime in the past few years. "Jessica," Dr. Morrison began, settling into a chair across from me, "I need you to help me understand what happened between you and Derek." I chose my words carefully. "Mrs. Morrison, Derek was terminated for violating company policy and SEC regulations. The specifics were documented thoroughly." "I'm not talking about the business details," she interrupted. "I'm talking about my son. The Derek I raised would never do the things Richard tells me he's been doing, threatening former colleagues, filing false reports, consorting with criminals like Cameron Wall." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and I realized this wasn't an interrogation. It was a mother's desperate attempt to understand how her child had become someone she didn't recognize. "Derek felt that I undermined his position within the company," I said gently. "But Miss Morrison, the actions I took were necessary to protect Morrison and Associates from significant legal and financial exposure." "Tell me about the Patricia Hendricks situation." "Derek says you manipulated the records to make him look incompetent." I spent the next 30 minutes walking Dr. Morrison through the entire sequence of events, from Derek's undisclosed conflicts of interest to his use of company funds to cover client losses. She listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed a sharp intellect behind her emotional distress. "My God," she whispered when I finished. "Richard was right. Derek could have gone to prison. The violations were serious." "Yes, but Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know that I took no pleasure in exposing them. Derek was my boss, and I respected the position, even when I disagreed with his decisions." Dr. Morrison stood up and walked to the window overlooking Lake Washington. "Derek came to see me yesterday. He was different, angry in a way I'd never seen before. He said you'd stolen his life, turned his father against him, destroyed everything he'd worked for. I'm sorry he feels that way, but he also said something that terrified me." She turned back to face me, her expression gray. "He said he was going to make you pay for what you'd done, whatever the cost." A chill ran down my spine. Did he specify what he meant? "No, but Jessica, you have to understand, Derek has never failed at anything in his life. Richard and I made sure of that. Private schools, tutors, connections, opportunities handed to him on a silver platter. This is the first time he's faced real consequences for his actions, and he doesn't know how to process it." "Mrs. Morrison, are you warning me about something specific?" She was quiet for a long moment, then walked to an antique desk and pulled out a manila folder. "Derek left this behind yesterday. I think you should see it." The folder contained a private investigator's report on my entire life. Bank records, academic transcripts, employment history, even photographs taken outside my apartment building. But what made my blood run cold were the detailed profiles of my family members, my parents in Spokane, my cousin Judge Chen, even my college friends like Sarah Kim. "He's not just investigating me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's researching everyone I care about." "Jessica, I'm not excusing Derek's behavior, but I'm afraid of what he might do next. He's surrounded himself with people like Cameron Walsh, who operate outside the boundaries of normal business conduct." I closed the folder, my hands shaking slightly. "Mrs. Morrison, why are you showing me this?" "Because 40 years ago I married into the Morrison family believing that privilege came with responsibility, that wealth and influence should be used to build something positive, not to destroy people who threaten your position." She sat back down, looking older than her years. "Derek has forgotten those lessons, if he ever learned them at all. What do you want me to do? I want you to be very, very careful, and I want you to know that not everyone in the Morrison family supports what Derek is doing. As I drove back to downtown Seattle, Morrison's warning echoed in my mind. Derek wasn't just angry, he was methodically planning something that would escalate far beyond corporate sabotage. The private investigator's report proved he was willing to target innocent people to get to me. That evening, Agent Martinez briefed me on the security team's findings. Miss Chen, we've identified at least 3 separate individuals conducting surveillance on your daily activities. Professional operatives, not amateurs. What kind of surveillance? Tracking your movements, photographing your contacts, monitoring your communications. Someone is building a comprehensive profile of your life and relationships. I thought about the folder Dr. Morrison had shown me. They're looking for leverage, ways to pressure me indirectly. That's our assessment as well, which is why we're recommending expanded protection for your family members. The idea of my parents needing bodyguards because of my corporate conflict with Derek Morrison was surreal and infuriating, but I called them that night and explained the situation as gently as possible. Jessica, my mother said, her voice tight with worry, maybe you should just find another job. No position is worth this kind of danger. Mom, if I run away now, Derek will, and he'll do the same thing to the next person who challenges him. But honey, we're proud of you no matter what job you have. Your father and I didn't sacrifice everything so you could put yourself in danger for some company. The conversation broke my heart. My parents had worked multiple jobs for decades to give me opportunities they'd never had, and now their daughter's success was putting them at risk. Monday morning brought news that Derek's campaign was expanding beyond personal attack. Marcus informed me that 2 of our biggest institutional clients, a pension fund and a university endowment, had received whistleblower reports alleging systemic fraud at Morrison and Associates. The reports are incredibly detailed, Marcus explained, handing me copies of the document. They include client names, transaction histories, and specific allegations of kickbacks and market manipulation. I studied the reports, recognizing Derek's intimate knowledge of the company's operations in every fabricated detail. But these weren't just accusations. They were carefully crafted legal documents designed to trigger formal investigations by multiple regulatory agencies. Marcus, this isn't just about me anymore. Derek is trying to destroy the entire company. It gets worse. The reports were apparently sent to the SEC, FINRA, the state attorney general and the IRS simultaneously. Someone wanted to ensure maximum regulatory scrutiny. Richard called an emergency meeting for noon. When I arrived in his office, I found him on the phone with what sounded like a very expensive attorney. Yes, I understand the implications, Richard was saying, but we need to get ahead of this before it spirals out of control. He hung up and turned to me, his face grim. Jessica, we have a problem. Derek has filed complaints with every financial regulatory agency in the country. Each one alleges systematic fraud involving you, me, and several other senior employees, but they're all false. Of course they're false, but defending against them will require extensive audits, legal fees that could bankrupt the company, and months of regulatory scrutiny that will drive away every client we have. The scope of Derek's strategy was becoming clear. He couldn't prove I was guilty of anything, so he was burying me and the entire company under an avalanche of investigations that would be impossible to handle simultaneously. There's more, Richard continued. The State Bar Association received a complaint, alleging that I've been practicing law without a license. Apparently Derek claims I've been providing legal advice to clients without proper certification. That's ridiculous. You're not practicing law. I know that, you know that. But the Bar Association has to investigate anyway. They've suspended my ability to serve on any boards or committees until the matter is resolved. I sat down heavily, finally understanding the full extent of Derek's plan. He wasn't just trying to destroy me. He was systematically dismantling his own father's life's work out of spite. Richard, this has to stop. Derek is willing to burn down everything you've built just to get revenge on me, which is exactly why I'm not backing down. Richard's voice carried a steel I'd never heard before. Jessica, Derek has become something I never thought possible, a threat to everything I believe in. I spent 40 years building this company's reputation, and I'm not going to let my own son destroy it. But the cost will be significant. Legal fees alone could run into the millions, but the alternative is surrendering to extortion, and I won't do that. That afternoon, I received a call that changed everything. The voice was unfamiliar, professionally neutral, but with an undercurrent of urgency. Miss Chen, this is Agent David Park with the FBI's White Collar Crime Division. We need to meet immediately. My blood went cold. About Derek Morrison, Cameron Walsh, and a conspiracy to commit securities fraud, extortion, and witness intimidation. The FBI office in downtown Seattle was a fortress of glass and steel that radiated federal authority. Agent Park was a compact man in his 40s with the intense focus of someone who'd spent years investigating financial crimes. He led me to a conference room where another agent, a woman named Jennifer Liu, was arranging files on the table. Ms. Chen, Agent Park began, we've been investigating Cameron Walsh for the past 6 months in connection with a series of fraudulent investment schemes. During that investigation, we discovered his recent association with Derek Morrison and their coordinated campaign against. Agent Liu opened one of the files. What we're about to show you is part of an ongoing federal investigation. We need your cooperation, but first we need you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. The files contained transcripts of recorded conversations between Derek and Cameron Walsh. As I read through them, my hands began to shake. The conversations detailed plans to frame me for crimes I'd never committed, to threaten my family members, and to systematically destroy Morrison and Associates through fraudulent regulatory complaints. But the most chilling exchange was dated just 2 days earlier. Walsh, the regulatory complaints aren't working fast enough. She's got too much support from the old man, Derek. Then we escalate, make it personal, make her understand that fighting us has consequences. Walsh, how personal are we talking? Derek, whatever it takes. I want her to disappear from Seattle entirely. Job, reputation, family connections, everything. Agent Park leaned forward. Miss Chen, Derek Morrison and Cameron Walsh are planning to escalate their campaign against you in ways that cross the line into federal crimes. We need your help to stop them. What kind of help? We want you to wear a wire. Get Derek to incriminate himself on tape. The request hit me like a physical blow. You want me to confront Derek directly. We want you to give him the opportunity to threaten you while we're recording. Based on our surveillance, he's planning something significant in the next few days. We need evidence of his intent to commit federal crimes. I thought about Dr. Morrison's warning, about the surveillance teams watching my every move, about the private investigators' files on my family. Derek had already crossed lines I'd never imagined, and he was planning to go further. If I do this, what guarantees do I have for my safety? Full federal protection, surveillance teams, emergency response, the works. But Miss Chen, you should know, if we don't stop Derek and Walsh now, their next escalation could put you and your family in real physical danger. As I sat in that sterile federal conference room, I realized that my transformation was finally complete. I'd started as Derek Morrison's invisible assistant, become his corporate rival, and now I was about to become a federal witness in a criminal conspiracy case. The war between Derek and me was about to end, one way or another. The wire was smaller than I'd expected, a device no bigger than a button hidden beneath my blazer. Agent Park had spent 2 hours briefing me on its operation and the FBI's surveillance protocol. Now, sitting in my car outside the Four Seasons Hotel, I was about to face Derek Morrison one final time. The meeting had been arranged through Madison Wells, who'd called that morning with what she described as Derek's final offer for resolving our conflict. The location was Derek's choice. The hotel's rooftop bar, public enough to seem safe, but isolated enough for a private conversation. Remember, Agent Park's voice crackled through my earpiece. Let him do the talking, ask questions that get him to explain his plans in detail. We need him to explicitly threaten you or your family. I took a deep breath and walked into the hotel. The elevator ride to the rooftop felt eternal, each floor bringing me closer to a confrontation that would determine everything. When the doors opened, I spotted Derek immediately. He was sitting alone at a corner table, wearing an expensive suit, but looking haggard. The past weeks of plotting and scheming had taken their toll. Jessica, Derek stood as I approached,
his smile cold but polite. Thank you for coming, Derek. You said you had a proposal. We sat across from each other, the Seattle skyline stretching out behind us. In different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like the setting for a final duel. You look tired, Derek observed, his eyes studying my face intently. All this stress must be exhausting. I'm managing fine, thank you. Derek leaned back in his chair, his confidence seeming to return. Are you? Because, from where I sit, it looks like your world is falling apart. Federal investigations, regulatory scrutiny, clients questioning your competence. That can't be easy. I kept my expression neutral despite the rage building inside me. Is that why you wanted to meet? To gloat? Actually, I wanted to offer you a way out. Derek signaled the waitress for drinks, playing the role of gracious host. You see, Jessica, this doesn't have to continue. All of this unpleasantness could disappear with a simple phone call. What kind of phone call? The kind where you admit to the SEC that you made mistakes in your analysis of my client portfolio management. The kind where you acknowledge that your accusations against me were based on incomplete information and personal bias. I stared at him in disbelief. You want me to confess to crimes I didn't commit? I want you to take responsibility for the chaos you've created. Derek's voice remained calm, but his eyes were cold. My family's reputation has been damaged, our company's clients are fleeing, and my father's health is suffering from the stress, all because you couldn't accept your place in the corporate hierarchy. The words escaped before I could stop them. Derek smiled, sensing he'd struck a nerve. Yes, Jessica, your place. You were an excellent secretary, truly, efficient, thorough, invisible when necessary, but you got ambitious, started thinking you deserved more than you'd earned. I earned everything I achieved through hard work and competence. Did you? Derek leaned forward, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. Or did you sleep your way into my father's good grace? It's remarkable how quickly you went from filing papers to advising on million-dollar transactions. The accusation was so vile, so calculated to destroy my reputation regardless of its falsity, that I felt momentarily stunned. Derek was trying to provoke me into an emotional response that would undermine my credibility. That's disgusting, Derek, and you know it's false. Do I? You're an attractive woman, my father is a lonely widower, and your rise in the company has been unprecedented. Derek shrugged as if discussing the weather. People are already talking, you know, wondering how someone with your background managed to gain so much influence so quickly. I forced myself to remain calm, remembering Agent Park's instructions. What exactly are you proposing? Simple. You confess to the regulatory violations you accused me of committing. You resign from Morrison and Associates with a statement admitting your incompetence, and you agree never to work in the financial industry again, and in return, the federal investigations disappear. The media attention stops. Your family members in Spokane stop receiving unexpected visits from private investigators. Derek's smile became predatory. Your parents are lovely people, by the way, your mother especially. It would be terrible if something happened to disrupt their comfortable retirement. The threat was explicit enough to be criminal, but Derek had delivered it with the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans. This was exactly what the FBI needed. You're threatening my family. I'm offering you a chance to protect them. There's a difference. Derek took a sip of his whiskey, savoring both the alcohol and my obvious distress. You see, Jessica, you never understood the game you were playing. This isn't just about business, it's about power, family, legacy, things that someone like you could never truly comprehend. Someone like me, an immigrant's daughter who clawed her way up from nothing. You thought that degrees and hard work would make you equal to people like my family, but you were wrong. We tolerate people like you when you're useful, but when you become a threat. Derek's voice trailed off meaningfully. The racism was as blatant as the threats, and I could feel my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, but I needed him to be more specific about his plan. What if I refuse your offer? Derek's expression darkened. Then things become very unpleasant for everyone you care about. Your parents' house in Spokane has a lovely garden, but it's very isolated. Your cousin, the judge, has such a promising career. Shame if ethics complaints started piling up. Your friend Sarah, at the prosecutor's office, has been working on some high-profile cases. Imagine if defense attorneys started receiving information about her personal life. Each threat was delivered with clinical precision, designed to cause maximum psychological damage. Derek had studied my relationships and identified exactly how to hurt me most effectively. You're talking about crimes, Derek: extortion, witness intimidation, harass. I'm talking about consequences, Derek corrected. Natural consequences for someone who refuses to accept reality. You damaged my reputation based on lies and manipulation. Now you're experiencing what it feels like to have your own life scrutinized. The evidence against you was documented and verified. The evidence was selectively presented to support a predetermined conclusion. Derek's voice was rising slightly, his professional facade slipping. You went into my files looking for problems because you wanted my job, my position, my place in the family business. I went into your files because your clients were losing money due to your conflicts of interest. My clients were making calculated investments with full knowledge of the risks involved. Patricia Hendricks wasn't informed that you had a personal stake in Nova Corp. That's a violation of SEC regulations, and you know it. Derek slammed his glass down on the table, whiskey sloshing over the rim. Patricia Hendricks is a senile old woman who shouldn't be managing her own finances anyway. I was doing her a favor by making investment decisions for her. The mask was finally slipping. Derek's carefully maintained image of wronged innocence was giving way to the arrogant entitlement that had driven his misconduct from the beginning. A favor? She lost $200,000. She would have lost more if I hadn't guided her investment. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to manage portfolios for people who have no understanding of market dynamics? Then why didn't you disclose your conflicts of interest as required by law? Derek stood up, abruptly, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. Because the law is written by bureaucrats who've never managed real money for real clients. Disclosure requirements are just paperwork designed to protect mediocre advisors from liability. He began pacing behind his chair, his agitation growing with each word. I was making profitable investments based on inside knowledge and industry connections. That's what clients pay for. Results, not compliance with arbitrary regulations written by people who've never created wealth in their lives.
Inside knowledge? Derek, what you're describing is securities fraud. What I'm describing is how real business works. Derek's voice was loud enough that other patrons were beginning to stare. You think successful people follow every petty rule and regulation? You think my father built this company by filling out disclosure forms and asking permission from government bureaucrats? Your father built the company by maintaining ethical standards and client trust. Derek laughed bitterly. My father built the company by making connections, leveraging relationships, and knowing when to bend rules that didn't serve his clients' interests. The difference is that he was smart enough not to document everything in official memos. The admission was devastating. Derek was confessing not just to his own violations, but suggesting a pattern of misconduct stretching back decades. Agent Park would have enough evidence to prosecute multiple federal crimes. So you admit to violating SEC regulation? Derek sat back down, leaning across the table aggressively. And I did it successfully until you decided to destroy my career out of petty jealousy. Jealousy? You couldn't stand being just a secretary while I had real authority and responsibility. So you manufactured a crisis to make yourself look indispensable while making me look incompetent. Derek, I prevented you from making investment decisions that could have bankrupted the company. You prevented me from making strategic investments that would have generated significant return. The Henderson acquisition would have been profitable if we'd structured it correctly, but you sabotaged it with your narrow-minded focus on potential liabilities. The conversation was spiraling beyond anything I'd expected. Derek wasn't just confessing to past crimes, he was revealing a worldview that justified any action in pursuit of profit. What about Cameron Walsh? I asked, remembering the FBI's evidence of their conspiracy. What role does he play in your natural consequence? Derek's expression became guarded. Cameron is a consultant who specializes in reputation management. Is that what you call filing false regulatory complaints and threatening witnesses? I call it fighting fire with fire. You used official channels to destroy my reputation, so I'm using the same channels to expose your incompetence and dishonesty. The complaints you filed contain fabricated evidence. The complaints contain alternative interpretations of ambiguous situations. If you're innocent, the investigations will clear you." Derek's smile returned cold and calculating. "Of course, the process might take years during which your career and personal life will be under constant scrutiny. And if I don't confess to crimes I didn't commit." Derek leaned back, his confidence fully restored. "Then you'll discover that I have resources you can't imagine and connections you can't match. Cameron has friends in regulatory agencies, media organizations, and law enforcement. Your life will become a series of investigations, audits, and legal challenges that will bankrupt you emotionally and financially." "You're describing a criminal conspiracy, Derek." "I'm describing the consequences of crossing the Morrison family." Derek stood up again, tossing money on the table for the drinks. "You have 48 hours to decide, Jessica. Confess and disappear, or watch everything you care about get systematically destroyed." He started to walk away, then turned back. "Oh, and Jessica, the surveillance on your family isn't ending anytime soon. My people know where your parents shop, where they eat, what time they take their evening walks. It would be such a shame if they had an accident while you're being stubborn about accepting responsibility for your actions." The threat was explicit, criminal, and captured perfectly by the FBI's recording equipment. Derek Morrison had just confessed to securities fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and witness intimidation, enough federal crimes to send him to prison for decades. As Derek disappeared into the elevator, I sat alone at the table, my hands shaking with a mixture of relief and residual fear. Agent Park's voice crackled through my earpiece. "Outstanding work, Miss Chen. We have everything we need." The arrest happened the next morning. I watched from my office window as FBI agents escorted Derek Morrison from his apartment building in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Cameron Walsh was arrested simultaneously at his office, along with 3 associates who'd been conducting surveillance on my family. The federal indictment was unsealed that afternoon, charging Derek with securities fraud, conspiracy, extortion, witness intimidation, and a dozen other federal crimes. The evidence was overwhelming: recorded conversations, email communications, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses. Richard Morrison called me into his office that evening, his face a mixture of relief and profound sadness. "Jessica, I owe you an apology and a debt of gratitude that I can never repay." "Richard, you don't owe me anything. You supported me when it mattered most." "I supported you because you were right, and because Derek had become someone I no longer recognized." Richard walked to his window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. 40 years I spent building this company, teaching Derek about ethics and responsibility, and he threw it all away because he couldn't accept that someone else might be more competent than he was. The aftermath unfolded quickly. The SEC dropped all investigations into my conduct after reviewing the FBI's evidence. The media coverage shifted from questioning my integrity to exposing Derek's conspiracy. Clients who'd been considering leaving Morrison and Associates decided to stay, impressed by the company's commitment to ethical practices. Derek's trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented evidence of a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to destroy careers and intimidate witnesses. Cameron Walsh pled guilty and testified against Derek in exchange for a reduced sentence. Madison Wells, who'd been unaware of the conspiracy's criminal elements, cooperated fully with authorities. Derek Morrison was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The judge noted that his actions had violated the basic trust that makes financial markets possible and represented a profound betrayal of his professional and familial responsibility. 6 months after Derek's conviction, Richard Morrison announced his retirement and recommended me as his successor. The board unanimously approved my appointment as president and CEO of Morrison & Associates. At 29, I became one of the youngest people ever to lead a major Seattle financial firm. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison attended my appointment ceremony, offering her support despite the pain of her son's imprisonment. "Derek made his choices," she told me after. "Now we have to live with the consequences and try to rebuild what he destroyed." The transformation was complete. I'd started as Derek Morrison's invisible secretary, someone he dismissed as just filing papers and fetching coffee. But through competence, integrity, and sheer determination, I'd not only survived his attempts to destroy me, I'd taken his place at the head of the family business he'd tried to inherit through privilege rather than merit. Morrison and Associates thrived under my leadership. We implemented new compliance procedures, expanded our client services, and built a reputation as one of the most ethical firms in the Pacific Northwest. The company Derek had nearly destroyed through his arrogance and criminality became stronger than ever. Sometimes I think about Derek's words that morning when everything began. "You're just a secretary, Jessica." He was wrong, of course. I was never just anything. I was an immigrant's daughter who understood the value of hard work, a woman who refused to accept limitations imposed by other people's prejudices, and a professional who put ethics above personal advancement. Derek Morrison learned too late that underestimating people based on their titles, their backgrounds, or their willingness to follow rules is the most dangerous mistake a person in power can make. He thought privilege and connections would protect him from consequence. He discovered that integrity and competence are more powerful than family names and inherited wealth. As I sit in the corner office that once belonged to Derek, looking out at Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond, I sometimes remember that rainy Tuesday morning when he dismissed me as just a secretary. It was the beginning of his downfall and the foundation of my rise. The best revenge, I learned, isn't destruction, it's transformation. Derek Morrison is serving 12 years in federal prison, but I'm not celebrating his suffering. I'm celebrating the fact that competence triumphed over entitlement, that hard work defeated inherited privilege, and that someone who was once invisible became the leader of everything her tormentor had tried to claim as his birthright. In the end, Derek was right about one thing. I was never just a secretary. I was his replacement, waiting patiently for him to give me the opportunity to prove it. And when that opportunity came, I was ready. The media coverage of Derek's downfall became a cautionary tale about corporate entitlement and the dangers of unchecked privilege. Business schools across the country began using the Morrison case as a study in ethical decision-making and the consequences of regulatory violation. Derek's name became synonymous with everything wrong with nepotistic corporate culture. Meanwhile, the transformation of Morrison and Associates under my leadership attracted national attention. Harvard Business Review featured our compliance innovations in a cover story titled "From Crisis to Excellence: How Ethical Leadership Transforms Organizations." The article detailed how we'd turned Derek's near destruction of the company into an opportunity to build something stronger and more sustainable. The success wasn't just financial, though the numbers were impressive. Under my leadership, client assets under management grew from $800 million to $1.2 billion within 18 months. Our client retention rate improved to 98%, the highest in the Seattle market. More importantly, we'd established a culture where ethical concerns were encouraged rather than punished, where junior employees felt empowered to question senior decisions, and where transparency replaced the secretive decision-making that had characterized Derek's tenure. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in our hiring and promotion practices. I instituted mentorship programs, specifically designed to identify and develop talent from underrepresented backgrounds. Within 2 years, Morrison and Associates had become known as one of the most diverse and inclusive firms in the Pacific Northwest financial sector. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek's attempts to destroy my career had ultimately led to opportunities I never could have imagined. Speaking engagements at financial conferences, board appointments at nonprofit organizations, recognition as one of Seattle's 40 under 40 business leaders, none of it would have happened if Derek had simply treated me with basic professional respect. Elizabeth Morrison became an unexpected ally in our transformation efforts. Despite the pain of her son's imprisonment, she chose to remain involved with the company as an advisor on family foundation investments. Her presence provided continuity and helped rebuild relationships with long-term clients who had been shaken by the scandal. "Jessica," she told me during one of our quarterly meetings, "Derek's downfall taught me something important about parental responsibility. Richard and I protected Derek from consequences his entire life, and we created a monster. What you've built here proves that character matters more than birthright." The legal proceedings continued for months after Derek's conviction. Civil lawsuits from damaged clients, regulatory settlements, and the complex process of unwinding Cameron Walsh's various schemes created a steady stream of legal work. But each resolution vindicated my original decision to expose Derek's misconduct, proving that the violations were even more extensive than I'd initially discovered. Patricia Hendricks, the elderly client whose losses had triggered the original investigation, became one of our strongest advocates. At 84, she possessed a sharp wit and clearer understanding of financial markets than Derek had ever given her credit for. During a client appreciation event, she pulled me aside with a comment that perfectly captured the transformation. "My dear," she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement, "when Derek told me I was too old to understand modern investing, I knew he was the wrong person to manage my money. But when you took the time to explain every transaction and ask for my input, I knew this company was finally in the right hands." The personal cost of the ordeal took longer to process. The months of stress, constant vigilance, and fear for my family's safety had left emotional scars that success couldn't completely heal. I began seeing a therapist who specialized in workplace trauma, learning to recognize and address the hypervigilance that had become second nature during Derek's campaign against me. My relationship with my parents deepened through the crisis. They'd witnessed their daughter under attack and had seen her emerge stronger than before. My father, who'd always been reserved about expressing pride, broke down crying when he saw the news coverage of my appointment as CEO. "We came to America so you could have opportunities," he told me through tears. "But we never imagined you'd achieve something like this." The success also brought unexpected romantic development. Marcus Chen, my former assistant who'd been promoted to senior analyst, had been a constant source of support throughout the crisis. Our professional relationship gradually evolved into something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the superficial attractions that characterized so many Seattle professional relationships. "You know," Marcus said, one evening as we worked late preparing for a board presentation, "Derek actually did us a favor by being such a terrible boss. If he'd been competent and ethical, we might never have gotten the chance to prove what we could accomplish." The observation was astute and surprisingly healing. Derek's toxicity had created opportunities for talented people like Marcus to advance more quickly than they would have in a traditionally managed organization. His downfall had cleared space for a new generation of leaders who understood that sustainable success required collaboration rather than domination. One of the most satisfying developments was watching the broader Seattle business community's response to our transformation. Competitors who'd initially viewed Morrison & Associates as weakened by scandal began trying to recruit our employees, recognizing the caliber of talent we'd developed. Other firms started implementing similar compliance innovations, acknowledging that our ethical approach hadn't compromised profitability, it had enhanced it. The regulatory agencies that had investigated Derek's complaints against me became some of our strongest endorsers. SE officials regularly cited Morrison & Associates as an example of how financial firms should operate, and we began hosting compliance training seminars for other organizations seeking to improve their ethical standards. Derek's prison sentence included restitution requirements that would take decades to fulfill. The judge had ordered him to pay back not just the money he'd stolen, but also the legal costs incurred by the company and the clients he'd damaged. From his federal prison cell, Derek was forced to watch as his former assistant built the kind of successful, respected career he'd always assumed was his birthright. Cameron Walsh received a shorter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but his reputation in Seattle was permanently destroyed. The crisis management firm he'd built collapsed within weeks of his arrest, and several of his former clients faced their own legal troubles as authorities investigated the methods he'd used on their behalf. Madison Wells, Derek's former girlfriend, reached out to me about a year after the trial. She'd left her job as a news anchor and was working for a nonprofit organization focused on corporate accountability. Her apology was genuine and her perspective on the events surprisingly insightful. "Derek convinced me that you were the villain in his story," she explained during our coffee meeting. "He was so charismatic, so confident in his version of events, that I never questioned whether he might be lying. It was a lesson in how dangerous charisma can be when it's not backed by character." The conversation helped me understand how Derek had maintained support among his social circle even as his behavior became increasingly erratic. People had wanted to believe his version of events because admitting his guilt would have forced them to acknowledge their own poor judgment in supporting him. 5 years after Derek's conviction, Morrison & Associates was recognized as the Employer of the Year by the Seattle Business Journal. The award ceremony was held at the same Four Seasons hotel where Derek had made his final threats against my family.
As I accepted the award, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me to that moment. In my acceptance speech, I chose not to mention Derek by name, but the subtext was clear to everyone who knew our history. This award belongs to every employee who has chosen integrity over convenience, who has spoken up when they witnessed wrongdoing, and who has proven that ethical behavior and business success are not just compatible, they're inseparable. The audience's standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, and I noticed several competitors in the crowd who were applauding not just politely but with genuine enthusiasm. We'd proven that principled leadership could succeed in a competitive market, and other business leaders were taking notice. Richard Morrison, now fully retired but still sharp at 78, attended the ceremony with Dr. Morris. During the reception afterward, he pulled me aside for a conversation that brought our journey full circle. "Jessica, when I first promoted you, I thought I was rewarding competence and giving you an opportunity to prove yourself. I had no idea I was setting in motion events that would save this company and transform an entire industry's approach to ethics. Richard, you took a risk on someone who had been dismissed and underestimated. That act of faith changed everything." "No," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Your response to that faith changed everything." Derek had every advantage I could give him: education, connections, opportunity, family support, but he lacked the one thing that can't be inherited: character. You had to earn everything you achieved, and that struggle built strength Derek never developed. The Morrison name still graces the building, but now it represents something Derek never understood: the idea that true leadership comes from serving others, not from exploiting the power you inherit. The company's mission statement, which I rewrote during my first year as CEO, reflects this philosophy. Morrison & Associates exists to help our clients achieve their financial goals through transparent, ethical advice and innovative investment strategies that prioritize long-term success over short-term gains. Every morning when I arrive at work, I remember that transformation is possible for anyone willing to fight for it, regardless of where they start or who tries to keep them down. The office that once belonged to Derek now houses a different kind of leader, one who earned her position through competence rather than inherited it through privilege, one who views power as a responsibility rather than a reward. Derek Morrison called me just a secretary and thought that defined my limitations. Instead, it became the foundation of my strength, the fuel for my determination, and ultimately the starting point for a transformation that exceeded even my own ambitious dream. And that, perhaps, is the most perfect revenge of all: not just defeating your opponent, but building something so much better than what they destroyed, that their memory becomes irrelevant to your success. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.